Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very exciting video today regarding Palantir Technologies because they have been awarded and have extended a very important contract that a lot of bears were pointing at for the previous few weeks that we saw it day over day. They have actually achieved this contract. We're going to be going into the details about this, and also regarding Palantir and the S&P 500. We're going to be talking about criteria, and is there a possibility that Palantir will actually be included in the S&P 500 in 2024? So before we get too far, hit that like button, subscribe for daily videos. Of course, I'm not a financial advisor. Take everything I say with a grain of salt and do your own research. I'm just collecting all the data and dispatching it to you. Now, quickly summarizing with Palantir's price action that we saw in terms of the last trading session. What we did have is an enormous amount of options volatility, and most of the options trading really accounted for about 70% of the underlying shares. We'll be going into detail about this towards the end of the video, but what we saw with Palantir is closing at 1820 and basically kind of pure disconsolidation on the day. We saw this with the global markets, some that were up about just about 0.5%, some down about 0.5%. So global markets pretty much consolidating throughout the whole day. What we saw was an interesting resistance point that was tested. However, we saw after that market open, a lot of buying pressure coming into Palantir, this enormous green wick candle bar that pushed Palantir here up into the 19s, as you can see right here, and there was actual resistance that was hit there, and we've seen this on various touch points that in the previous few months, Palantir has had 3 touch points at that 19. So there could be resistance that is being formed there, and that would put resistance at the 19s and then again at the 20s, which what we've seen up here. But in terms of trading volume, sitting right now at 93 million, Palantir is looking fairly well. And quickly, before we get too far into the options, in terms of expirations for next week, we have a lot of call volumes at the $19 strike price and even over 10,000 in terms of volume beyond at the $20 strike price and at the 19.5. So lots of people are taking a bullish position on Palantir here in the short-term future by the end of the year. Now, one of the big things that we do have is that Palantir receives this $115 million Army contract extension, and this is great as it's helped push Palantir higher after the news was finally released. And looking into the details of this contract is that this includes 35.6 million of an actual initial funding and then an award of 97.4 million. Now, talking about that with governmental contracts, this has been the majority revenue generator for Palantir. As they see here, Palantir garners nearly 60% of its revenue from governmental agencies. What we have seen in the recent past, though, especially with last quarter, is that Palantir has really taken a dive with their AIP software and their AIP bootcamp, really tapping into the commercial side of things that we saw last week with multiple different partnerships on the actual commercial venture. But with that, this in all is a win, with the expectations that this provides the Army another year to formalize structure with Palantir in terms of this contract. And why we talk about that is because remember when William Blair came out here and talked about how this contract is going to be shorter and at a lower value. That is true, but this caused a lot of uncertainty, and I think this extension of a contract I think is a win no matter what. Rather than not having a contract being renewed at all, then that could have brought a lot more fear and uncertainty to Palantir. So the fact that there are additional vendors here that are coming in that the Army is actually looking into, this just allows Palantir to stay competitive and also basically prove that it is one of the biggest AI leading data analytic softwares out there in the industry, and they can continue to prove this. And we've seen this with their track record just year to date right here, up 183%. So gaining 183% right here. Yes, a little bit of some corrections that we have seen, especially like I said with this William Blair analyst, but with that contract actually being extension, you can see the market actually didn't react too poorly to this, considering there was a large push that did test that $19 level of resistance. Going into the next piece of news right here, this is talking about the S&P 500 and for Palantir in 2024. Now, this comes from the Motley Fool here, talking about the next stop for the S&P 500. I think it's important to understand what is the criteria, first of all, for a stock to be included in the S&P 500, and that is that the company must be headquartered in the US and it must have a GAAP profitability over the last 4 quarters. After Palantir released their Q3 earnings report, that gave them their 4th quarter of GAAP profit profitability. And in addition, the majority of shares outstanding must be available to the public, and basically the company must have at least a market cap of over 14.5 billion. Where Palantir does sit right now is at 39 billion, so well above that threshold. And Palantir does meet the criteria and basically can be included in the S&P 500. Now the question is, when is that going to happen? Because the S&P changes members periodically, and generally on average there's about 20 new stocks that join the index in a year. But however, to gain entry into this high profile broad market index, one thing that the S&P 500 must do, if Palantir was to be included in the S&P 500, is that it must replace another stock that is already in there. And the criteria for removal is not basically as clear as the criteria for addition into the S&P 500. So Palantir's market cap of about 40 billion, this actually makes it more valuable than nearly 300 of the 500 stocks on the S&P 500. And I think this increases the chances, considering that it's really far past that 14.5 billion market cap threshold. And talking about that, what we typically seen, what Motley Fool here reports about stocks that are included in the S&P 500 is typically a 5% bump when they do get added. And that is because the index funds, there's many ETFs and index funds that do track the S&P 500, they have to include the stock into their fund. So there's automatically a decent amount of buying pressure that comes from a variety of different investors, basically, that weren't individually invested in Palantir in the first place. Now, other high profile stocks that we have seen with Palantir, that we've seen in the S&P 500 recently are Uber that we've seen and Airbnb, and both of them gained 6.2% and 7.2% respectively. So talking about that, I think we could see Palantir in the S&P 500 in 2024. I think that's entirely possible, and I think that would be a very bullish catalyst for this AI data analytics software going forward, and possibly hitting some of the higher price targets that we have talked about in the mid-20s, the 30s, the 40s, or hey, maybe even 50. But talking about that, what we have seen, like I wanted to talk about, was the options volatility that we did see. We saw a total of 463 contracts that were traded, representing about, like I said, 71% of Palantir underlying shares, and where a lot of volatility right now is sitting at about that $18.50 strike price that we've seen. And going into next week, like we talked about, look out for that 19, and specifically looking at that $20 strike price. There are a lot of eyeballs looking at this increasing in price within next week. However, what we could have, like I said, is a correction at any point. Bullish catalyst that we do have going into 2024, though, not on a short term, on a long term. Data dispatch here is going to be remaining bullish on Palantir. That is because I think we could likely see inclusion into the S&P 500. I think our views kind of align with the Motley Fool's views right there, talking about that just in terms of this stock and how it compares to some of the other stocks within the S&P 500. It's already outbeating a lot of those stocks in terms of market capitalization. Number two is we have those interest rates that are continuing, and they say will be cut next year, and not just next year, but going into 2025. This brings a general buying confidence into the general market. More speculative stocks and more speculative industries like AI will be affected with a lot of volatility, hopefully in the bullish perspective. Number three is that Palantir is continuing to grow with its customer count, not only from a governmental contractual basis, but also diving into their commercial side of things. So I think with expansion here and with those three things that we just mentioned, we have an exciting year for Palantir 2024. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Peace out. Take care. What do you guys think? Let's talk about it down in the comments, and I'll catch you guys later.